student farm right now, but as you can see, I found this nice little place to sit in with a bunch of fruit trees. And to start off, we're going to be talking about common garden insects that you could find and how to recognize them. And to keep things fresh, we're going to be ranking them on a tier from S to F, based on how beneficial these insects are to your garden. Let's start with some basic anatomy. So for insects, we have three separate parts. We have the head, and then the thorax, and then the abdomen. And they're divided into these three sections, where the head has its eyes, the mouth parts, and ocelli, which help detect the light that's coming usually from the top of their heads. The thorax has most of the locomotion, which is the legs and the wings. And finally, the abdomen is where you have most of the guts and where the insect digests food and excretes waste. So the first thing we're going to start with is bees. This I'm going to rank as the S tier insect. This kind of bee is usually thought of as the most beneficial insect in the garden, but there are over 1,500 different wild native bees that exist in California that are also super beneficial and help pollinate in your garden. They usually have more rounded body compared to, say, a wasp. These bees look much more rounded and, say, pudgier, if that makes any sense. They also have long elbowed antennae that stick out in front of their heads, and they're generally fairly long, and we'll see an example of a fly later so you can see the difference. They have hairs on their legs and their abdomens, which is really important for carrying a lot of pollen, because they generally carry a large, poofy pollen load, and each bee species can carry these loads in different spots. It could be on the legs or underneath the abdomen. And finally, the most important distinction, or if you can get close enough to see it, that is the four wings. Bees have four wings, whereas flies only have two. Alright, so the second insect that we have today is the syrphid fly, or the hoverfly, and I'm putting this at an S tier as well. So you might mistake these insects for bees because they look really similar, but they actually are flies. And you can usually differentiate them by their really short and stubby antennae, and this could be kind of hard to see depending how close you are, but generally speaking, they would look significantly shorter than you would expect on a bee. They also have these really big eyes in front of their head, and you could almost say that their head is mostly made of eyes because they're so big. And also, they have two wings, so that's also a very important distinction between a fly and a bee, or any other wasp-like insect. And they're usually not very fluffy compared to a bee. And some of these, actually I'd say most of these flies are able to hover, so they will help pollinate your flowers. And the funny thing is, they have these really weird looking larvae that almost look like slugs. And these are really beneficial because they consume a lot of the soft-bodied insects that you might find in your garden that are very pestilent. So they're like aphids and whiteflies and thrips, and even some caterpillars. So the next one we have is the predatory wasp, which I'm ranking as a B tier. Even though these insects are super useful to have in your garden, they can cause a bit of pest issues if you have a lot of them, but they are pretty useful overall. They help to consume a lot of your pest insects in the garden, such as caterpillars and some really nasty beetles that you don't want. But as you know, they can still sting you, so that's a problem. You can tell them apart by their relatively narrow waist on between their thorax and abdomen, and this would be a really good indicator that it's a wasp and not a bee or a fly. Secondly, they have four generally narrow wings. They have a lot of variations here, but they would be narrower than a regular bee. Another important distinction is their patterns. So on the abdomen, you'll see very clear stripes that are not on fur or anything. It's just directly on their exoskeleton. And this could have a lot of patterns from stripes to zigzags, and it would be the most distinctive feature if you're not trained to look for them. Additionally, they don't carry any pollen on their bodies, so sometimes you might find some pollen grains here and there, but they generally don't carry a huge load. So the first insect we have on our A tier is the black soldier fly. This is a really confusing insect sometimes, and I've often made the mistake myself of calling it a bug, but it's actually a fly. They look really cool, as you can see in this picture, and they might look really scary and make a whole bunch of buzzing noises. It might even sound like a plane, if you could hear it in the background. But they're really great for your compost because they help decay your plant matter and make your compost go faster. They could even predate some of your houseflies, so could get rid of some pests, which is why they're in A tier. But one of their issues is that they can compete with worms. So if you're doing wormy composting, they can compete and cause your worms to not be as efficient. So be on the lookout for that. Right, so we have 3 insects that I'm going to do all together because they all belong in F tier. These are the aphids, the whiteflies, and the thrips. And in terms of aphids, these are like very plump, usually green, but they can be red, purplish, or black in color. And thrips are these really miniature and slender insects. They can be pale yellow to brown or even black in color. And the next one is whiteflies, and these are not true flies. They are actually hemipterans or bugs. They look like white tiny moths, but just remember they're actually bugs. So the major problem with these 3 insects are that they can suck out the juices from your plants. And this is a major problem because then they leave a huge sticky mess on your plants, and that could also lead to sooty mold to form, which is really bad for your plants' photosynthesis since it blocks out all that light. And another major factor is that these insects reproduce really quickly. So they can have like stacked generations where the mom can make multiple clones of itself in a series, which is really crazy, especially aphids. And finally, they can vector plant diseases. So a lot of plant viruses can be vectored by them, and the damage they cause could open up your plants to a lot of bacterial diseases and fungi. Right, so the next one on our S tier list are the ladybugs and friends. And I added in friends because there's a lot of them. So these insects are all super beneficial in the garden because they eat many of the soft-bodied insects like those aphids, whiteflies, and thrips that I mentioned earlier. They come in a lot of shapes and colors, and you might recognize some really common ones that are the red and black spotted ones. But as you can see, there's tons and tons of variations in this group of insects. So for C tier, it's not going to really be one insect. It's going to be like a whole group of insects. This is going to be really general because they're such a huge group, but it's the beetles. Not that beetles, this beetles. So some of these are like really good for your garden, such as ground beetles and soldier beetles, but there's also quite a large family that are responsible for causing a lot of damage to your garden, such as flea beetles and Japanese beetles and various weevils, and these all cause a variety of different types of damage, from feeding on your leaves to the roots, even to stems. Some of them are even able to girdle the bark on your trees, which can be a problem if you have fruit trees like these. And you can recognize these beetles through their hardened elytra, which is their outer shell. It's also covering their wings like a protective coat. beetles come in a variety of different shapes and forms, so there's no one real descriptor other than looking at their shells. Right, another insect for the S tier. We have the lacewing. So this insect is a really beneficial insect for eating all those aphids, whiteflies, and thrips that we've mentioned. And they are able to fly, although they don't fly well. They are able to move around your garden to eat the insects. You could recognize them as a larvae or an adult. So the larvae have these huge mandibles, and they eat most of the aphids and sometimes whitefly, but mostly aphids. And then the adults can be green or yellow in color. Interestingly enough, they lay eggs in a really weird way. They have stalked eggs, so you can see in this picture, they have an egg on top of a sort of stalk-like, stalk-like thing, and that's how they protect their eggs from getting eaten by others. So the final insects we have are caterpillars. I put them in D tier because their larval forms can be a serious pest, but their adult forms are mostly okay. So caterpillars can eat through a lot of your garden, although most of them are species specific, so it'll really depend on what species are around and but generally caterpillars can defoliate some of your plants, and especially if you're growing edible crops, they can really decimate things. So typically the adult is recognized by their really large wings, which they use to fly, but the larvae are very small and squishy looking. They have only 6 true legs, so when you see a caterpillar, they might look like they have a lot more. That's because they have various sets of prolegs, which they use to help grip onto things, but they're not true legs and able to move independently. These caterpillars can be hairy or smooth, just depending on the species. Some of them could actually be really pokey to pick up, so you don't want to pick up random caterpillars. And they come in a variety of different colors. And you can differentiate a caterpillar from a beetle grub just by where they're located. So most caterpillars would like to spend their time on leaves and on the top side of plants rather than living in the soil. Alright, so thanks for watching. That's the end of the list I have, and this is just my opinion, so if you have any differences or you want to re-rank them, feel free to add them below in the comments. But ultimately, I hope you've learned something new about your common garden insects, and I hope you can check out these other videos we have, and follow us at Aggies Grow Veggies here on YouTube or at Aggies Grow on Instagram.